Joining us on the Unspoken podcast, a lot going on in the NBA world, and joining us to talk some NBA, and he covers the NBA for CBS Sports. Brad Botkin is joining us on the podcast. Brad, thanks for coming on with us.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Right into the controversy. We heard the Kevin Durant comments. What do you make of Kevin Durant's recent comments about the toxic culture around LeBron James? Does he have a point? What could be the possible ramifications of his comments?
No, I think it's, I kind of think it's a bit of a diversion tactic to kind of throw people off the scent of the speculation that he's going to end up with LeBron in LA next year. He likes to kind of play around with the media that way. Now, I think that it's rooted in some truth in the sense that a coach is pretty much perpetually on the hot seat when you're coaching a LeBron James team. There's always that kind of smoke around the team as soon as they go on a 4-game losing streak. And there's always sort of the unforgiving element of being a LeBron James teammate in terms of when things go wrong, it's the supporting cast's fault. And when things go right, LeBron gets the credit. So there's definitely some difficult circumstances to navigate with being on a LeBron James team, but toxic, I don't think I would go that far. What's interesting is I've actually talked to a few players around the league, not in terms of the toxicity that may or may not exist in the locker room, but just in terms of the actual basketball and playing alongside LeBron James. It's not as easy a fit as sometimes it's made out to be. I think sometimes we project this idea that LeBron makes everybody better around him. That hasn't been the case. I was talking with Joe Ingles of the Utah Jazz earlier this year, and he pointed to Rodney Hood and Jay Crowder. If you remember, Rodney Hood was a 16, 17-point-a-game guy, a borderline future kind of franchise cornerstone in Utah, and he got traded to the Cavs and fell off a cliff. And on the flip side, Jay Crowder was doing nothing in Cleveland. As soon as he got moved to Utah, he was back to the Jay Crowder that we knew from Boston. When you play alongside LeBron, you play on his terms. You don't get to shoot from your spots. You get the pass when he feels like delivering it. Not everybody responds. We're seeing Brandon Ingram, for instance, having a tough time playing alongside LeBron James. So these superstars that have a myriad of options, and they don't have to play on anybody else's terms, you're seeing now that guys have, to some degree, passed up on the opportunity to play with LeBron. We thought Kawhi Leonard was kind of a lock to end up there, and speculation now is that that's certainly not the case. Paul George was pretty much linked to LA for 2 years, and then he passed up, didn't even take a meeting with the Lakers. Kyrie obviously wanted out in Cleveland. So playing alongside LeBron James has its challenges. The toxicity of the environment, I think, is a bit exaggerated.
Well, speaking of comments on LeBron, Brad, what do you make of Kobe's comments that the Lakers will soon win an NBA title and laugh in the faces of Golden State fans? Kobe's got plenty of stands on his side too. They may very well win a title. I don't see this as some sort of, thinly veiled statement that they're about to make some big deal and everybody's going to see it come to light soon enough. I just think, they have LeBron James. They've got a window here. If they add one more star player, they're certainly going to be in the mix to win a title. So it's not that bold of a proclamation that the Lakers are going to be a title team here in the next few years. I will say they got to get somebody else. So Kobe can talk all he wants. Laker fans can talk all they want. They're nowhere near title ready right now as long as the Golden State Warriors exist. And that's where Kevin Durant right now really is the most powerful guy in the league, in that he can kind of uproot and start, a championship team in one swoop. He can kind of derail the Warriors and start up the Lakers if he goes there. And I think that's kind of what Lakers fans are planning on, that Durant either ends up there or Kawhi ends up there, or, really what I'm hearing around the league, and this is certainly nothing that, I'm reporting on, but just kind of you talk to people from different teams, you get an idea of the way the wind is blowing. And, I think Anthony Davis really ultimately is the target of the Lakers. I think he's the target of the Celtics too, but I think all those assets the Lakers are sort of hoarding that they didn't want to give up for Paul George. They didn't want to give up for a potential Kawhi Leonard trade. Bradley Beal is out there right now, and some people have argued they should move a couple of their young guys for him, but I think behind closed doors, what's going on is they don't want to give up any assets until the possibility that Anthony Davis becomes available, because they'll throw the house at the Pelicans for him.
Speaking of Kevin Durant and that power struggle, and we've seen all the issues going on with the Warriors. Why is it that we're seeing more of a media circus around the Warriors these days?
I think to some degree they've gotten so big that there has to be a circus now. The NBA is kind of strange that way, right? Where it's almost as much about, or even more about, oftentimes the off-court stories, the locker room drama, the podcast beefs, than it is the actual game on the court. Because to me, unfortunately, it's one of the it is the most predictable league in terms of who's going to win. So we kind of have to inundate ourselves with all this kind of drama on the outside. I think a lot of it is created with the Warriors. They've won so much. They've been so successful. They sort of had such that boy next door image in the light of Curry for so long. They don't do anything wrong. They're selfless. And so I think any kind of flare up that any team is bound to have, that's together this long and has this level of success and is under this kind of scrutiny and pressure for 9 months every year. I think that it's been overplayed a lot. And I think, frankly, we need something to write about with the Warriors and talk about, because there's nothing really left. How much can you talk about how great Stephen Curry is, or how great Kevin Durant is, or any of these things that have sort of been taking up the on-court storylines for the last 4 years? And certainly now, without a legitimate rival in play in terms of LeBron being with the Cavs and the Western Conference having fallen off a bit, the gap between the Warriors and the next best team in the Western Conference has widened significantly from last year. The Rockets have taken a fall. I just honestly think we have to create things to talk about with the Warriors. It's not to suggest that, some of these beefs that they have aren't real, but it is to suggest that those happen on every team. It's just heightened when it's on the best team.
Now, Brad, what's going on with Markelle Fultz, his agents, and the 76ers? We hear that he might be injured. We hear it might be mental. The organization isn't happy with Fultz's agent. Can you make sense of this mess, and can the 76ers savage Fultz at this point?
It's interesting. Thoracic outlet syndrome, if I've got that right. So I spent yesterday talking to a couple of doctors and a couple of specialists that deal with neurology and soft tissue injuries and chiropractic work, and had a lot of experience in this area and have seen cases like this. One of the guys I talked to has actually worked with a lot of the Carolina Panthers. With close to, at least in the family of this type of injury. And so I asked him, what the hell took so long? If the Sixers seemingly would have every incentive to turn over every rock to figure out what's wrong with this guy that they committed a lot of money and a first round, number one overall draft pick to, how can we go 18 months here and not have any idea what this is? And suddenly he shows up in a specialist office and boom, here it is, 3 to 6 weeks recovery, and we're all good. And what I was told was that these nerve issues are notoriously difficult to diagnose because they're effectively kind of a diagnosis of exclusion, if you will. They're a process of elimination. In other words, you go in and you check all the structural stuff, you do the MRIs, and nothing shows up. And so they say nothing's wrong, and then he comes back out and plays, but it still hurts. And by the end, you've kind of exhausted every option, and you say, almost by default, well, it must be a nerve issue, because it's nothing you can see on an MRI. It's nothing you can see in an X-ray. It's just really a functionality test. And if you line up the symptoms, they're pretty identical to what this diagnosis is. So I think it's pretty safe to say that they're onto something here. And the doctors that I spoke to said this is absolutely treatable. That's the good news. The unknown news is this all that's wrong with Markelle Fultz? At some point, it's my opinion, I have nothing to base this on, but it's my opinion that this thing probably started out as a physical issue. But somewhere along the way, at least to a degree, it morphed into a mental issue. And so even when he gets physically fixed, I think it's going to take a while, if ever, for him to get back that full level of confidence. It's like somebody who maybe they got the yips playing golf, and it started out because their hip was screwed up or whatever. They fixed the physical issue, but they still got the yips a little bit. So, what I've heard in talking to a few opposing execs around the league is that Philadelphia now is in a very interesting situation, because it's certainly encouraging news that there appears to be a remedy for what's going on physically. So they can go one of two ways with that. They can say, hey, our asset might not be screwed. We hang on a little while longer. We might get the Markelle Fultz we thought we were getting when we took him number one overall. Or they take advantage of this small window where their leverage might be increased a little bit, because other teams are now saying the same thing. Hey, might be willing to take a chance here on Markelle Fultz because stands to reason that he can be fixed. And they might be able to get a little more value in a trade right now than, say, 6 weeks from now when he comes out and what do you know, he's not fixed. And so it's really an interesting situation for Philadelphia. I still tend to think they're going to lean toward trading him. I think that they are ready to win right now. When they acquired Jimmy Butler, they got into win right now mode. I don't think that they have another year for Markelle Fultz to sort of regain his confidence, regain his swagger, even if the physical part comes back in 6 to 8 weeks. I think they need a guy that can help them right now. And on the flip side, I think it'd be better for Markelle to go somewhere where they're not under the spotlight of championship expectations, and he can take the next year without everybody watching to sort of get his game back at his own pace if indeed this physical therapy takes care of the physical issue.
Let's keep it to that with Jimmy Butler, his move to Philadelphia, and essentially taking Fultz's place in the process plans. Do you think the 76ers have solidified themselves as a more viable team than the Celtics to win the Eastern Conference, or do you think the Celtics, the Raptors, are still too much for a young team like the Sixers to handle?
I think the Raptors are clearly the best team in the East. After that, I would say Milwaukee, Boston, and Philadelphia it's up in the air. And that, a number of scouts that I've spoken to would say the same thing or have said the same thing to me. By far and away from a depth standpoint, Kawhi Leonard, I think, is the best player in the Eastern Conference. Giannis certainly has an argument. But the Raptors just have everything. I think they're really good. I think they're really the only team right now that's capable of threatening the Warriors in a potential finals matchup. But the Sixers are really good. Jimmy Butler really helps them because they were lacking a one-on-one creator in the half court. I spoke with a scout that said they were going to have a major ceiling as long as Ben Simmons was going to continue to be the focal point in the half court. There's only so much you can do with a guy that won't shoot outside 8 feet. And we saw him get exposed in last year's playoffs against the Celtics, who effectively schemed him right out of the game. He was losing significant fourth quarter minutes to TJ McConnell. So they needed a guy that they can go to late in games down the stretch against set defenses who can just flat out go get a bucket. And Jimmy Butler can do that. Now, they compromised depth in the deal. They lost 2 starters, only got 1 back. They also compromised shooting. They were already thin on shooting with Simmons and Fultz. And so they lose Ilyasova, they lose Bellinelli. Those weren't sexy names, but those guys were huge for them in the playoffs last year. So they're at a shooting deficit, they're at a depth deficit, which is why most people that I talk to think they still need to make another move. And that's where Markelle Fultz comes into this. They need another shooter, if not 2 more. They'll look on the buyout market. Trevor Ariza will be out there. Maybe they can swing a huge deal for Bradley Beal. They have the assets to do that. If they paired up Zaire Smith, Markelle Fultz, and Wilson Chandler's money, who's expiring next year, they can make a deal work. If they threw in their Miami 2021 pick, they actually have the assets to get a Bradley Beal trade done, and I wouldn't rule that out. And at that point, they would be a super team. But I think even if they just add a couple of fringe shooters to space the floor and give Jimmy Butler room to work in the half court, the Sixers can absolutely get out of the East. I think it's pretty wide open with the edge going to Toronto, but the Sixers are definitely good enough to make real noise.
Talking to Brad Botkin, who covers the NBA for CBS Sports, keeping it with Toronto. Seems like Masai Ujiri had a lot of comments to say, especially to Rachel Nichols. Has never done anything malicious toward Lowry, that if it was wrong to deal DeMar DeRozan, there are 2 things in this business that are tough: when a player leaves, and Kawhi Leonard left, and then when a player gets traded. Those 2 things are tough, and in our position, we have to do them, and we have to deal with them. What do you make of Masai Ujiri's quotes, and do you think that there's a distraction between him and Kyle Lowry that's going to affect their season?
No, I don't think there's a distraction. I mean, I think Lowry's comments to Nichols were pretty telling, that, he's certainly still not happy about the way that went down. Having said that, I mean, I think we all understand here, this is a business. I mean, the bottom line here is DeRozan and Lowry were friends. They shipped his friend out. And maybe they didn't tell him the way that Lowry expected to be told. I think he said he received a phone call at 2:30 in the morning from DeRozan. So, didn't find out the way he wanted to find out, was kind of blindsided, and his friend left town. From a basketball standpoint, the Raptors did everything they could to give DeRozan every chance to be the guy that they needed him to be to take the team to the next level. When they gave him, I think, a $139 million contract at the time, I want to say that was either the largest or the second largest contract in NBA history. Let me tell you something. DeMar DeRozan has never come close to doing anything even remotely close to being worthy of the second highest contract in NBA history, ever. He's been a nice player, an all-star level player, second highest paid player in NBA history. Now, I know that had to do with the influx of the cap that year, but still, they gave him a ton of money. And at the end of the day, they got to the playoffs and they got worked over by LeBron James. He wasn't even playing in the fourth quarter of some games. You know, if you're going to go to the next level and you have a chance to get Kawhi Leonard, the gap between him and DeMar DeRozan is so significant, particularly come playoff time where star power and one-on-one players become so important. There's just no way the Raptors can't pull the trigger on that deal. I mean, I think Masai Ujiri said it. The definition of insanity, right, is you keep doing the same thing over and over and think it's going to change. The Raptors had kind of run their course of running back the same team, the same two stars, the same style of play, and thinking somehow it was going to be different. They absolutely got better with Kawhi Leonard, and from a competitive standpoint, I think Kyle Lowry knows that. I think he just still is a little bit bent on the way it happened.
Now let's take it to Hassan Whiteside. He left the bench early after being benched in the fourth quarter recently. Supposedly he had a bladder issue, but the guy has a lot of talent, but there's a lot of questions concerning his character, whether or not he can be a leader. Do you think that he can turn this guy around and be the star that everyone thinks he can be?
No. I mean, turn around there. I guess there are degrees of turning someone around. Look, he's rebounding like crazy this year. There are a lot of games where he puts up numbers, but he's just kind of an unimpactful player. He's never going to be kind of the focused team defender that you need a big to be. And he's just never going to have that outside shot that bigs need to have these days. He's just very limited in terms of the way he can impact games, the way it's played in today's NBA. And on top of it, he's bitter. You know, he has a bad attitude. He thinks he deserves more than he gets in terms of playing time and respect. And he's just kind of a crybaby. You know, I live in Miami, and I'm down at a lot of the Heat games. And, you know, the fact of the matter is they're paying this guy $100 million to be a star, and he's not even a functional player in crunch time of big games. So forget about being a star. I think at this point he is what he is. I think they would trade him in a heartbeat if anybody else would be dumb enough to take that contract, which they aren't. So, look, it's just another guy that I think the Heat have overpaid, with it being the most egregious example on a roster that's sort of filled with guys they gave too much money. Tyler Johnson, I think, is over $50 million. Justice Winslow just got a new contract. He's okay. You know, he's not making a huge difference. They gave Dion Waiters a huge contract in terms of how relative to how much he had produced. He's not going to take your team anywhere. So they've just given too much money to too many players that don't make enough impact, with Whiteside being the most egregious example. And they got to figure it out. They were hard on the case for Jimmy Butler. They know they need to make a deal, but the fact is they don't have a lot of tradable contracts, with Whiteside being at the top. Who wants that contract for that player? Nobody. And so they got to deal with it.
Speaking of abysmal situations, the Bulls are off to an abysmal 5-20 start, which led to the firing of coach Fred Hoiberg. We also heard that he lost control of the team. What do you think led to this firing? And do you think we should also question the decision-making of John Paxson and Gar Forman?
No question. I mean, they're going through coaches here like, you know, donuts at Dunkin' Donuts. So they keep rattling them through, and none of them work out. You know, you have to set a coach up to some degree to succeed. They've never put a roster in place that was going to be terribly conducive with the pace and space style that Hoiberg wants to play. And they put a bunch of guys on these teams that, you know, that don't make sense. You know, how are you going to hold a guy defensively accountable when you sign Zach LaVine and Jabari Parker? And Chris Dunn has been injured. If you were going to get rid of Hoiberg, you know, I don't think in the middle. How did you think this season was going to go, given the injuries and given the roster that you put together? And, you know, somewhere in the middle of this 5-6 year run with this management team, they decided to bring in Rondo and Dwayne Wade and take a run at the vet, you know, and spent a bunch of money there, and then bailed on the Jimmy Butler and went and got Markkanen and Levine and Dunn and bring them in. It's a new wave. But then we go get Jabari Parker and sort of like blow that up with a guy that has never played defense, has never been an efficient offensive player. They've just spent money in strange ways. And, you know, when you do that and you put a product on the floor that is pretty obviously going to produce at an inferior level, you're not giving the coach much of a chance. Now, you know, if they didn't think Hoiberg was the guy, then that's fine. I'm not sitting here advocating that Hoiberg deserved more or he's a good coach and they did him wrong. I'm just saying that you can't really hold him accountable to the front office's mistakes. If you don't think Hoiberg was the guy, they've had multiple chances to get rid of him prior to this. It's a strange timing. It's sort of like when the Suns got rid of their GM, after he had drafted DeAndre Ayton number 1, after they had made some pretty significant franchise-changing moves, including changing coaches. If you'd brought in a new GM prior to that who would have had some say in who they take number 1, maybe somebody who would have wanted Luca Dantas, to give these guys, to give Fred Hoiberg sort of the authority to say, this is the kind of team I want, then you give him a different team and expect him to win with it, or the Suns GM to give him the number 1 pick and give him, the decision power to change coaches, but then change GMs after he makes those decisions. You're dealing bad cards here and asking guys to play with bad hands. So the timing just looks weird.
All right, Brad. Russell Westbrook just passed Jason Kidd for 3rd all-time on the triple-doubles list. Where do you see Westbrook among all the all-time greats?
No, he's not among the all-time greats. I mean, the better question, I think, is always where do you see him among the best players in the game today? He's really a polarizing player for obvious reasons. He puts up crazy numbers, but let's be honest about this. Numbers aside, what evidence have we seen that a Russell Westbrook-led team, where he's clearly the number 1 best player on the team, can do anything but be kind of a high 40s win team and get bounced in the first round? We've seen what he can be as the second best player. He was really good, and the Thunder were really good when they had Kevin Durant. But when an inefficient shooter and a guy who takes the kind of shots that he takes is the best player on your team, we'll see what he can do with that. And before we talk about him anywhere near the all-time greats, he's going to have to do something in terms of actually winning as the best player on a team. And he's got a hell of an opportunity to do that this year. This is by far and away the best Thunder team since Durant left. He's got a fellow superstar in Paul George. He's got a defense that is playing at a phenomenal rate. I looked last time I checked, I think over the last 8 games, they have a defensive rating down in the low 90s for the season. They're right at 100. I mean, they are by far and away the best defense in the league. And they're missing arguably the best defensive player in Andre Robertson. So when they get him back, man, they're going to be able to switch everything. They're versatile. They're long. They're athletic. They can get out in the open court and run. Really, the only thing they're missing is shooting. But they got one-on-one players in Westbrook and George. They're monsters on the glass with Steven Adams. This is a really, really good team. And if they only end up winning 49, 50 games and they lose in the first round again, there's going to be no way to see it as anything other than something of a referendum on Russell Westbrook. Because let's face it, I'm going to ask you guys this. If you replaced Russell Westbrook right now with the true top players in the league right now, in other words, if you put LeBron James on the Thunder with Paul George and with that defense, if you put Stephen Curry with Paul George in that defense, if you put Kevin Durant with Paul George in that defense, if you put Giannis with Paul George in that defense, if you put Kawhi, we know that Thunder team would be an absolute bona fide title contender. But what can we honestly say about the Thunder with Westbrook as the best player? Is anybody willing to bet anything of any significant amount that they're anything more than a first-round team? I mean, they could be, but I certainly wouldn't bet a lot on it. And that traces right back to Russell Westbrook. Because like I said, if you put the truly elite players in his place on the Thunder right now, they would be an absolute title contender. And they're not that with Russell Westbrook. At least they haven't proved to be. So this year is going to tell us a lot.
Well, I'll follow up with that before I move on to something else. Do you think that the Russell Westbrook situation with Paul George is kind of like the Durant, Harden, having that big 3 back in the day? Do you think that we could see the same situation where they're a dominating team on offense, but then they don't go all the way through, like you said?
No, I mean, I think the problem with Harden is he was the third guy. Durant and Westbrook worked just fine, and I think that's what we'll see with Durant and George. The problem with Harden is he was young in his career. I think he was a 6th man on that team. And you've got a budding superstar that's ready to get paid like that and is ready to start being a focal point of the offense like Harden was at that time. And that's a whole other animal. And so that's why, this Thunder team is really suited. They have a clear hierarchy. It's George, it's Westbrook in the half court. It's a whole bunch of guys who play defense and get steals and loose balls and play hard. And the roles are pretty clearly defined. And like I say, with 2 pretty irrefutably top 15 players, arguably top 10, and the best defense in the league, that alone, right there, you should be a title contender. That's sort of like a lesser version of the Warriors, who are playing with 2 top 5 players. But the Thunder are playing with 2 top 10 players. They shouldn't be that far behind. And so, like I said, we're going to see a lot this year because I firmly believe that you could take somewhere between 8 and 10 of the top players in the league and flip them out for Westbrook, and the Thunder would be a really good team. I mean, I'm sitting here right now imagining what the Thunder would be with Kawhi and Paul George and that defense. They'd be monsters. And so the fact that I don't see them that way right now until, sort of further evidence tells me a lot about Westbrook. But, I'm pulling for him. I like him. He plays hard. I think a lot of people root for him to prove that he can win. We'll see this year.
Now let's move on to the one of the young phenoms of the NBA, and Luca Dantas. The guy has been great so far. He's had 3 15-assist games so far when nobody else has done that at all. Do you see Dantas being the next star big man, even at the age of 19? And what do you attest to these 15-assist games?
I'm going to have to check that. Does he has 3 15-assist games? That's pretty crazy if he does.
I mean, that's what I saw on the stat line. They were comparing this to like almost Wilt Chamberlain in a sense with the average amount of assists.
Luke, I'm going to have to double check that. Look, we're talking about Luca Dantas with the Mavs. Okay, yeah. I'm going to check the assists. But look, bottom line is Luca should have gone number 1 overall. He was by far and away the most proven, most ready player in the draft. He's perfect for today's NBA. He can shoot, pass, and dribble at that size. He's going to develop defensively. I was talking with a GM in the league who said he's actually further ahead than he expected at this point because of the three-point shooting. He was only a 30% shooter in Europe. There was a lot of big shots that he made, the viral clips that everybody watched on YouTube, but from a consistency standpoint, he was only a 30% three-point shooter, and that was from a shorter line in Europe. To come over to the NBA the very next season at 19 years old and bump it up to 40% from a deeper line, it's just totally changing the game because now you got to push out a lot farther on him than you thought you needed to, and that opens up his floor game, which has always been splendid. You can't guard this guy with his handle, his vision, his ability to make plays and hit creative runners and find teammates. He's to your point, the best part of his game may be his passing, and we haven't even really seen that unlocked yet because Dennis Smith Jr. runs the point, and they hide Luka, not hide, but they let him hang out down in the corner down there, and they bring him into the offense either on a dribble handoff or different ways where he kind of initiates the offense as in a secondary role. But he's not the guy who's running the show every single possession. So there's still a lot to come from Luca Dantas. He's an amazing talent. A special talent. And I think we're going to be talking about that trade that Atlanta made with Trae Young for a long time. Trae Young's been really good in his own right despite his shooting struggles. But Atlanta may have given up a generational player in Luca Dantas. And I know I've spoken with Atlanta GM Travis Schlenk, who obviously facilitated that deal. And he did it because they saw Trae Young and Luca Dantas as relatively even players, and Dallas threw in an extra number 1 pick into the deal, and that swung the tide for the Hawks, who know that they need multiple players to build this thing into a contender. So they say, hey, we'll get Trae Young plus a first-round pick next year. We think the combination of those two things will be better than Luca Dantas. Right now, I'm not so sure. Luca has looked special.
Final question here, Brad. So there's another league, the NHL, and they just made an announcement that in 2021, 2022, they were going to add an expansion team in Seattle. Now we've heard the rumors about the NBA. We've had the demand to bring back the Supersonics, and Kevin Durant recently made a comment about being a potential owner after his career is over. Do you see the NBA going back to Seattle anytime soon?
Yeah, I do. I think that they'll eventually end up back in Seattle. It's a great basketball city. It's a great sports city, and the NBA is in a position to expand. Contrary to what I believe, the NHL should, I think, be diminishing some of their teams and condensing in terms of their talent distribution. The NBA is full of stars, full of hype around the world. The league is doing nothing but growing. I think there's a pretty safe bet that there'll certainly be expansion, and if there's expansion, Seattle looks like one of the top places that it'll end up going. So yeah, I think that's a safe bet that sometime, I don't know. I'm not plugged in enough to the league office or the rumors that run through those circles to put a timetable on it. But 5 years, 5 years. I mean, I think that's probably fair. I think it's a pretty safe bet that someday we'll be seeing a team in Seattle again.
I mean, do you make the preseason game in Key Arena and also I don't know if you heard this, but the $700 million renovations of Key Arena? So
yeah,
I guess that's kind of a step in that direction, right?
Well, no question. You've got to put the things in place to make it attractive enough to happen. I mean, the city of Seattle is going to want to make it look like as much of a turnkey situation as possible. Hey, look, we've got a renovated arena. Hey, look, we've got this thing going here. We got this there. We got the interest here. We've got sponsors there. They want to get this thing in sort of a blueprint laid out that the NBA can just walk in and say, okay, let's do it. And certainly, playing the game up there, that's not that veiled of an attempt to bring back excitement and start associating the NBA with Seattle again. I think if I remember right, that game was the Warriors, wasn't it? Didn't they send Durant back up there?
Yeah, I think he wore the Kemp jersey, right?
Well, exactly. So, I mean, it's, this isn't by accident. The NBA is not stupid. So, I mean, and I don't think it's any big secret. The NBA wants to return to Seattle. I think it's on Seattle and the NBA to put it in a place where it can happen easily. And the things that you alluded to, I think, are making that happen. You slowly regenerate interest there by bringing the games back up there and regenerating that fan appeal with Durant, who was drafted there, and all that. And then you get the arena ready. And I think they're doing that.
Brad Botkin covers the NBA for CBS Sports. Follow him on Twitter at Brad Botkin CBS. Brad, thanks for coming on. Very informative.
Okay, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Brad.